Let me tell you something. I was never the smartest looking quarterback in the room, and Lord knows I took enough hits to prove it. But I knew football. I knew what it felt like when a great player walked onto the field and everybody suddenly got a little quieter. Coaches stopped joking. Linemen started checking their chin straps. Quarterbacks like me started wondering how fast we could get rid of the ball. I played 14 years in Pittsburgh, and I was lucky enough to stand beside some of the toughest men this game has ever seen. I also spent plenty of Sundays running away from a few of them. So when somebody asks me about the 5 greatest players I ever saw, I don't pull out a book of statistics. I don't need one. I remember the sound of the pads, the look in a man's eyes, and the way a game changed when he decided to take it over. That is the kind of greatness I'm talking about. The first player I have to talk about is Alan Page. Now, I know some folks are going to expect me to start with a quarterback, but that's not how I remember football. I remember the men who made my Sundays miserable, and Alan Page sure knew how to do that. The first time I really appreciated what kind of player he wasn't because of some highlight on television. It was because I had to stand back there with the ball in my hands knowing he could wreck a play without even touching me. That's what the truly great defensive players do. They make you think before the ball is snapped. When we played the Vikings in Super Bowl IX after the 1974 season, everybody talked about the Purple People Eaters, and they deserved every bit of that reputation. Carl Eller, Jim Marshall, Gary Larson, and Alan Page were as good a defensive front as I'd ever seen. But Page was different. He wasn't just trying to overpower you. He was studying you. He watched your cadence. He watched your feet. He knew where a quarterback wanted to step. And somehow he always seemed to arrive there a split second too early. People see that he won the NFL Most Valuable Player Award in 1971 and think that's impressive because he was a defensive tackle. It is. But what impressed me was how he earned it. He never took plays off. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to celebrate. He just kept beating the man in front of him over and over again until your offense started making mistakes all by itself. I remember our coaches talking all week about keeping the pocket clean. That sounds simple until Alan Page is lined up across from you. He had that first step that could make a guard look slow, and once he slipped through a gap, your whole timing disappeared. A quarterback lives on timing. Lose that, and everything starts falling apart. What always stayed with me was how complete he was as a football player. He had strength, but he relied just as much on intelligence. Years later, when he became a justice on the Minnesota Supreme Court, I wasn't surprised at all. I remember thinking, well, that makes perfect sense. The same mind that solved offensive lines every Sunday was now solving legal problems. Looking back, it almost feels like that career was waiting for him all along. I've played with Hall of Famers and against Hall of Famers, but Alan Page belongs in a different conversation. He proved that dominance isn't always loud. Sometimes the most dangerous man on the field is the one who lets his play do every bit of the talking. Every time I think back to those Steelers and Vikings battles, I still see number 88 moving toward me, and I still remember how quickly a quarterback learns to respect a man like Alan Page. That's why he'll always have a place on my list. The next player I want to talk about is Roger Staubach. Now, Roger and I were different in just about every way. A couple of quarterbacks could be different. He came out of the Naval Academy, carried himself like a man who had every button fastened and always seemed to know exactly what he wanted to say. I came out of Louisiana, talked too much, laughed too loud, and spent a good part of my early career trying to convince people in Pittsburgh that I actually belonged there. But when we stepped onto a football field, I understood him. Roger was a competitor in the purest sense of the word. He did not panic, he did not quit, and he never believed a game was over while there was still time on the clock. We met in 2 Super Bowls, and people still ask me what it felt like going against the Cowboys in those games. Let me tell you, it felt like standing across from a team that was never going to give you anything easy. Super Bowl X in January of 1976 was close all the way through. We knew Roger could hurt us with his arm, but he could also escape when the pocket broke down. That was a real problem. A defense could cover everybody, get pressure exactly where it wanted, and somehow Roger would slide out, buy another second, and find somebody downfield. That kind of play can drain the life out of a defense. The thing I respected most was his calm. I have seen quarterbacks look composed when they are winning. That is easy. Roger looked the same when things were going badly. His shoulders did not drop. His eyes did not change. He walked back into the huddle like the next play was the only thing that mattered. That is leadership. It is not a speech. It is not waving your arms or screaming at people. It is letting 10 other men know that you still believe. Then we met again in Super Bowl XIII in January of 1979. That game had everything. Big plays, mistakes, pressure, and 2 teams that knew each other's reputation. we got ahead. But nobody on our sideline relaxed because Roger Staubach was still standing over there. He brought Dallas back late, and I remember thinking that we had better finish the job because he was not going away. That was Roger. You could hit him, chase him, make him throw the ball away, and he would come right back on the next snap as if nothing happened. People called him Captain Comeback, and that was not some clever nickname invented after his career. He earned it. He had this stubborn belief that one more drive could change everything. As a quarterback, I admired that because I knew how hard it was to keep your head when a game started slipping away. Roger never looked like the moment was too big for him. I also respected the way he represented the position. He was tough without acting tough. He was confident without needing to tell everybody how good he was. We competed hard, and of course I wanted to beat him every time, but there was never any question in my mind about the kind of player he was. When I think about the greatest quarterbacks I ever saw, Roger Staubach is right there because he gave his team belief. As long as he had the football, the Cowboys had a chance. There are plenty of men who can throw a pretty pass. Roger could carry the pressure of an entire team and still make everybody around him feel calm. That is rare, and that is why he belongs on this list. The next player I want to talk about is Joe Greene. Now, Joe is different from everybody else on this list because I did not have to study him from the other sideline. I lived with that man. I practiced against him. I sat in the same locker room with him. I watched him help turn the Pittsburgh Steelers from a team people laughed at into a team nobody wanted to play. And let me tell you something, that change did not begin with me. It began when Joe Greene walked through the door. I arrived in Pittsburgh in 1970, 1 year after Joe, and I was the first pick in the draft. That sounds real nice today. Back then, it meant I was a young quarterback walking into a hard city with a football team that had spent a long time losing. People expected me to fix everything right away. I was trying to learn the offense, trying not to get killed in practice, and trying to understand why everybody looked so serious all the time. Then there was Joe. He did not need to explain what he expected. You could feel it. Joe was not loud every minute of the day. That is the part people sometimes get wrong. He had fire, no question about it, but he was not walking around giving speeches just to hear himself talk. When Joe spoke, it mattered. When he practiced, everybody else had to match him. If the defense was having a strong day and the offense started getting frustrated, Joe did not apologize for it. He believed that if we could survive against our own defense during the week, Sundays would feel a little easier. I can laugh about it now, but practicing against Joe Greene was not my idea of a pleasant afternoon. I would come to the line, look at him in the middle, and know he was about to make somebody's life miserable. He had strength, but that was not the whole story. Joe was quick. He understood leverage. He could split a double team before the play had time to develop. Sometimes I would take the snap turn to make a handoff, and Joe was already where the running back was supposed to go. I remember thinking, how in the world did he get there that fast? What made him great was what he demanded from everybody around him. Joe did not accept that old idea that Pittsburgh was supposed to lose. He hated it. The city was built on hard work, and he played exactly that way. By the time we reached the playoffs in the early 1970s, the whole attitude of the organization had changed. We were not hoping to compete anymore. We expected to win. The 1974 season was when everything came together. We had young players all over that roster, but Joe was the foundation. In Super Bowl IX against Minnesota, our defense controlled that football game. The Vikings finished with almost nothing on offense, and Joe was right in the middle of it. He recovered a fumble, intercepted a pass, and spent the afternoon destroying the inside of their offense. I was on the sideline watching him and thinking, thank God he plays for us. That is the honest truth. Quarterbacks get attention because we touch the ball on every offensive play, but those Steelers teams had a heartbeat, and Joe Greene was that heartbeat. When I struggled early in my career, and Lord knows I struggled plenty, Joe never treated me like some hopeless kid who did not belong. He wanted toughness from me. He wanted me to keep getting up. That mattered because there were days when Pittsburgh was not an easy place to be a quarterback. We eventually won 4 Super Bowls together, and people remember the trophies, the steel curtain, and all those Hall of Fame names. But I remember the beginning. I remember when none of that existed yet. Joe Greene helped create it. He was one of the greatest defensive players who ever lived, but that is not the main reason he is this high on my list. Joe changed the standards of an entire franchise. He taught all of us what winning was supposed to look like before we had actually won anything. That is leadership you cannot measure. And when I think about the men who shaped my football life, Joe Greene will always be near the top. The next player I want to talk about is Walter Payton. Now, I did not share a locker room with Walter, and I was not chasing him around every Sunday, but you did not need to play beside that man to understand what made him special. You could see it on film. You could hear it in the way defensive players talked about him. And when you watched him in person, you realized pretty quickly that sweetness was one of those nicknames that only told half the story. Walter could smile, joke around, and carry himself with real warmth. But once the ball was snapped, there was nothing soft about him. He came into the league with Chicago in 1975, and those Bears teams were not loaded with offensive weapons. Everybody in the stadium knew who was getting the football. The linebackers knew. The defensive backs knew. The people sitting in the upper deck knew. Walter knew. They knew, and he still found a way to move the chains. That is one of the hardest things a running back can do. There is no mystery, no clever disguise, and no easy matchup. The defense is waiting for you, and you have to beat it anyway. I remember watching that 1,977 season and thinking the man was carrying an entire offense on his shoulders. He ran for 185, 2 yards, and scored 14 rushing touchdowns, but those numbers still do not explain what it looked like. He ran with patience when he needed it, then exploded through a crease before it closed. He could lower his shoulder, bounce outside, leap over a defender, or cut back against the flow. He did not have one way to beat you. That was the problem. Then there was that game against Minnesota on the 20th of November, 1977. Walter ran for 275 yards, which was an NFL record at the time, and he did it while dealing with flu-like symptoms. Now, I have played football when I felt bad. I have played with aches, bruises, and a head that was not exactly working the way the good Lord intended. But 275 yards against a professional defense when you are sick, that is not normal. That tells you something about the way Walter was built inside. What I admired most was that he never treated contact like something to avoid completely. He was smart enough not to run straight into trouble every play, but he was willing to finish runs. Defensive backs would come up expecting to make a clean tackle, and Walter would make them pay for it. Sometimes he delivered the hit. Sometimes he twisted free. Sometimes he kept those legs driving until 3 men had to bring him down. And he did everything. People remember the rushing yards, but Walter could catch the football, pick up a blitz, throw a pass, and help his team in ways that never appeared in a headline. As a quarterback, I respected the blocking. Fans do not always notice a running back stepping into the path of a charging linebacker, but quarterbacks notice. That kind of play tells you whether a man cares about the whole offense or only his own statistics. Walter also played with a kind of pride that never looked selfish. Chicago went through hard seasons before the Bears became champions, but he kept showing up. He did not save his effort for the days when everything was going well. He ran the same way when the team was behind, when the weather was miserable, and when defenses were loading the line of scrimmage just to stop him. By the time he retired after the 1987 season, he had become the NFL's all-time leading rusher. But when I think about Walter Payton, I do not picture a record book. I picture a man refusing to go down. I picture defenders taking the right angle and still missing. I picture a player who made hard football look joyful. There have been bigger running backs and faster running backs. There have been men who played in more explosive offenses. But I am not sure I ever saw one who gave you more on every snap than Walter Payton. He could beat you with talent, toughness, balance, intelligence, and heart. And if I were building a football team from nothing, I would want a man like that in the middle of it. And finally, the greatest player I ever saw was Johnny Unitas. Now, I know people are going to argue with me because that is what football people do. Put 5 of us in a room, ask one question, and somehow you get 12 different answers. But when I think about the man who defined what the quarterback position was supposed to be, I keep coming back to Johnny Unitas. He was the standard before I ever took a snap in Pittsburgh. Long before anybody knew my name, I was watching that high-top haircut, those black cleats, and that right arm deliver the football exactly where it needed to go. Johnny did not look like some polished creation built in a laboratory. He looked like a regular man who had walked in from a construction job and decided to play quarterback that afternoon. That was part of what made him so believable. Nothing about him felt fake. He stood in the pocket, took the hit, and completed the pass. Then he went back to the huddle like it was simply what he was expected to do. I grew up in Louisiana watching quarterbacks and dreaming about playing the position, and Johnny was always there in my mind. The 1,958 NFL championship game against the New York Giants became one of those games every young quarterback heard about. Baltimore came from behind. Johnny led the drive that tied the game, and then the Colts won in overtime. People call it the greatest game ever played because it helped turn professional football into something the whole country wanted to watch. But for quarterbacks, it meant something more. It showed what leadership looked like when everything was sitting on one man's shoulders. What separated Johnny was not just his arm. Plenty of men could throw a football. He understood the whole field. He knew how to move defenders with his eyes. He knew when to stay patient and when to attack. He could walk to the line of scrimmage, recognize what the defense was giving him, and change the play without making the moment look complicated. That is the kind of control every quarterback wants, but very few ever truly have. I also love the toughness. Johnny played in an era when quarterbacks were not protected the way they are today. Defensive linemen could drive you into the ground, linebackers could arrive late, and nobody was throwing a flag because your feelings got hurt. Johnny stood in there anyway. He was not trying to prove how tough he was. He simply believed the throw had to be made, and if the hit came with it, then that was part of the job. That attitude mattered to me because my early years in Pittsburgh were rough. I got booed. I got benched. I threw interceptions and heard people wonder whether the Steelers had made a terrible mistake drafting me first overall in 1970. There were moments when the easiest thing would have been to feel sorry for myself. But quarterbacks like Johnny Unitas had already shown us that the position demanded something harder. You had to stay in the pocket. You had to return to the huddle. You had to call the next play like you still believed in it. I faced Johnny late in his career when the Steelers played Baltimore. By then, he had already built his legend. He did not need to prove anything to a young quarterback like me. But I remember the presence. There are certain men who carry history with them when they walk onto a field. Johnny had that. You knew you were looking at someone who had changed the position. He threw a touchdown pass in 47 consecutive games from 1,956 through 1,960, a record that stood for more than half a century. But even that number does not fully explain him. What matters is that week after week, defense after defense, he found a way to lead his team into the end zone. He made consistency look like courage. A lot has changed in football. The offenses are different. The rules are different. Quarterbacks train differently, throw more often, and play in systems Johnny never saw. But the heart of the position has not changed. Stand in there. Know where everybody belongs. Take responsibility. Make the throw when the game is tight. Johnny Unitas did all of that before the rest of us. He gave quarterbacks like me a picture of what greatness looked like. I won 4 Super Bowls, and I am proud of that. But I also know I was walking down a road Johnny helped build. That is why when you ask me for the greatest player I ever saw, I do not hesitate. For me, it was Johnny Unitas. You know, the older I get, the less interested I am in arguing over who was better by 1 yard, 1 touchdown, or 1 championship. I have spent too much of my life around football to believe greatness can be reduced to a clean little number. Alan Page could destroy the middle of an offense with intelligence and speed. Roger Staubach could keep a game alive when everybody else thought it was finished. Joe Greene could change the attitude of an entire organization just by refusing to accept losing. Walter Payton could carry a football team, take every hit a defense had to offer, and still come back smiling. Johnny Unitas showed every quarterback who followed him what courage, command, and responsibility looked like. Those men were not great in the same way, and that is exactly the point. Football needs different kinds of greatness. It needs the quiet thinker, the comeback leader, the locker room standard, the relentless runner, and the quarterback who teaches a generation how the position should be played. I was lucky. I did not have to learn about these men from old photographs or stories somebody else told me. I saw them. I stood across from some of them. I shared a locker room with one of them. I felt the pressure they created and the respect they earned. 4 Super Bowl rings gave me a lot of memories, but the men I encountered along the way gave those memories meaning. When I think about the greatest players I ever saw, these are the 5 who still come to mind first. And after all these years, I still feel grateful that football put me close enough to witness what real greatness looked like.